The humid Chicago air of 2004 did not smell like destiny. It smelled of diesel fumes, Lake Michigan salt, and the frantic sweat of a long-shot campaign. In a cramped office cluttered with lukewarm coffee and stacks of policy papers, a man with a name most Americans couldn't yet pronounce sat hunched over a legal pad. Barack Hussein Obama was not yet a symbol or a movement. He was a state senator with a hole in his shoe, and a recurring dream that the fractured lines of his country could, with enough rhythmic persuasion, be stitched back together. The humid Chicago air of 2004 did not smell like destiny. It smelled of diesel fumes, Lake Michigan salt, and the frantic sweat of a long-shot campaign. In a cramped office cluttered with lukewarm coffee and stacks of policy papers, a man with a name most Americans couldn't yet pronounce sat hunched over a legal pad. Barack Hussein Obama was not yet a symbol or a movement. He was a state senator with a hole in his shoe, and a recurring dream that the fractured lines of his country could, with enough rhythmic persuasion, be stitched back together. He looked at the draft of the speech meant for the Democratic National Convention. To the political establishment, he was a diversity hire for the podium, a safe face to offer a few minutes of platitudes before the heavyweights took the stage. But as he scratched out lines and replaced them with the cadences of the South Side and the intellectual rigor of Harvard Law, he wasn't writing a speech. He was drafting a manifesto for a new American century. The story of Barack Obama does not begin in the Oval Office, nor does it begin on that stage in Boston. It begins in the improbable collision of worlds, a restless young man from Kansas and a brilliant, idealistic student from Kenya. Their union was a statistical impossibility in the 1960s, a legal defiance in many parts of the very country their son would one day lead. From the volcanic soil of Hawaii to the chaotic streets of Jakarta, young Barry lived a life of mirrors. He was a child of the world who belonged nowhere and everywhere. In Indonesia, he watched his stepfather grapple with the ghosts of a violent regime, learning early that power was a fickle, often cruel master. Back in Honolulu, under the watchful, pragmatic eyes of his grandparents, Gramps and Toot, he navigated the quiet complexities of being a black boy in a white household, searching for his father's ghost in books and old letters. By the time he reached Occidental College and later Columbia University, the search for identity had turned into an intellectual hunger. He wasn't just looking for his place in America, he was looking for why America was so often at war with itself. He chose Chicago, the city of broad shoulders and deep-seated segregation, as his laboratory. As a community organizer on the South Side, he learned that change didn't come from soaring rhetoric alone. It came from the grit of church basements, the anger of laid-off steelworkers, and the quiet dignity of mothers trying to keep their sons alive in the crossfire of the projects. It was here, amidst the red bricks and the winter wind, that he met Michelle Robinson. She was his tether to the reality of the Black American experience, brilliant, skeptical, and rooted in the soil he was just beginning to understand. Together, they would build a partnership that wasn't just a marriage, but a political force of nature. The climb was anything but a straight line. There were crushing defeats, like the 2000 congressional primary, where he was dismissed as not black enough or too academic. He was a man out of time, a bridge builder in an era that was starting to prefer walls. But then came 2004. That night in Boston, the red and blue lights of the Fleet Center hit his face, and he spoke of a thin, tall kid with a funny name who believed that America has a place for him too. In 20 minutes, the trajectory of the 21st century shifted. The Audacity of Hope wasn't just a book title, it became a call to arms for a generation tired of the old guard. The 2008 campaign was a technological and cultural revolution. Against the formidable Clinton machine and the veteran heroism of John McCain, Obama ran a campaign fueled by the internet and a yes we can spirit that felt more like a religious revival than a political race. When the results flashed on the screens, on November 4, 2008, and Grant Park erupted in a sea of tears and flags, it felt as though the ghost of the Civil War had finally been laid to rest. But the reality of governing was a cold shower of global financial collapse and two grinding wars. The story of his presidency is one of impossible choices. The high-stakes gamble of the bin Laden raid, where he sat in a situation room watching a silent feed as Navy SEALs vanished into the dark. The grueling, soul-crushing battle for the Affordable Care Act, where he traded political capital for the lives of millions, and the tears he shed in the briefing room after Sandy Hook, realizing that even the most powerful man on earth couldn't protect children from the madness of their own countrymen. Through the surges in Afghanistan, the rise of the Tea Party, and the grace he showed singing Amazing Grace in Charleston, Obama remained a figure of immense poise and polarizing impact. He was the president of the future who had to navigate the prejudices of the past. As of April 2026, Barack Obama's private life is a sophisticated blend of high-level production, global influence, and a focus on his long-term legacy in Chicago. While he has traded the nuclear football for Netflix deals and Broadway investments, he remains one of the most active former presidents in history. Here is a snapshot of his life and major projects right now. The grand opening countdown, June 2026. The most significant milestone in his post-presidency is just weeks away. The Obama Presidential Center in Chicago's South Side is scheduled to open on June 19, 2026, Juneteenth. A cultural hub, this is not a traditional library. It's a 19-acre campus featuring a 225-foot museum tower, a public library branch, and over 20 commissioned art installations. Tickets and tours. Tickets for the public go on sale May 6, 2026. Visitors will be able to walk through a full-scale replica of the Oval Office and view exhibits on everything from the ACA to Michelle's fashion legacy. Broadway and the media empire. Through their production company, Higher Ground, Barack and Michelle have officially ventured onto the Broadway stage. Proof on Broadway. On March 31, 2026, a revival of the play Proof opened in New York, starring Don Cheadle and Ayo Edebiri, with the Obamas serving as producers. Netflix and podcasts. They continue to dominate streaming with projects like the documentary series Our Oceans, narrated by Barack, and the podcast IMO, In My Opinion, hosted by Michelle and her brother Craig Robinson. The citizen lifestyle. Obama has successfully transitioned into a life that balances privacy with public presence. The D.C. Martha's Vineyard split. He spends most of his time between his home in Washington, D.C., to stay close to the political and cultural pulse, and his estate in Martha's Vineyard, where he is known to enjoy long days of golf and oceanside dinners. Focus. Even at 64, he maintains a strict 45-minute daily workout routine. He remains a night owl, often seen reading late into the evening or working on his various philanthropic initiatives. Mentorship and my brother's keeper. While he rarely comments on day-to-day partisan politics, he is heavily involved in the MBK alliance. In April 2026, he has been particularly active in convening the inaugural class of MBK ambassadors, focusing on mentorship for young men of color across the United States. In the winter of 2007, the political experts in Washington, D.C. had already written the obituary for the Obama campaign. The consensus was clear. Hillary Clinton was inevitable, and Barack Obama was a nice guy who was 4 years too early. But inside a drafty campaign headquarters in Des Moines, the atmosphere was different. It didn't feel like a political office. It felt like a tech startup, fueled by caffeine and the intoxicating belief that the rules of gravity no longer applied. The strategy was simple but dangerous. Win Iowa, a state that was 90% white, to prove to the rest of Black America that a black man could actually win. Obama spent months in retail politics, the kind of grueling face-to-face campaigning that strips a man of his ego. He sat in living rooms in Council Bluffs and diners in Cedar Rapids, drinking bad coffee and listening to farmers talk about the price of corn and the cost of insulin. He wasn't giving the Boston speech here. He was doing something harder. He was convincing skeptical Midwesterners that he understood their lives better than the establishment did. The night of the Iowa caucus, January 3, 2008, the air was bone-chillingly cold. David Plouffe and David Axelrod, his chief strategists, paced the floors. If they came in third, the dream was over before it began. But as the returns started trickling in, a quiet shock settled over the country. Young people, first-time voters, and disillusioned Republicans were turning out in record numbers. When Obama took the stage that night to declare victory, the hook had finally caught the jaw of the nation. They said this day would never come, he told the roaring crowd, his voice rasping but triumphant. They said our sights were set too high. They said this country was too divided, too disillusioned, to ever come together around a common purpose. But Iowa was just the beginning of the gauntlet. The campaign soon moved into the primary wars, a brutal month-to-month slog that tested his temperament. He had to face the race speech in Philadelphia, a more perfect union, after his former pastor's controversial remarks threatened to derail everything. Standing in the National Constitution Center, Obama did something no politician is supposed to do. He spoke honestly about the complexities of race in America. He didn't offer a soundbite. He offered a history lesson. By the time the general election rolled around in the fall of 2008, the world was collapsing. The Lehman Brothers bankruptcy triggered a global financial meltdown. While his opponent, John McCain, briefly suspended his campaign in a frantic gesture, Obama remained no-drama Obama. He sat with economic advisors, absorbing the terrifying reality that the next president might inherit a second Great Depression. His calm, some called it aloofness, others called it presidential, became his greatest asset. On a warm November night in Chicago, 2008, 1 million people crammed into Grant Park. The bulletproof glass surrounding the lectern was a reminder of the risks he had taken. As the screens turned blue, signaling a landslide victory, the world held its breath. If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, Obama began, looking out at a sea of faces that reflected every corner of the globe, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time, who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer. But as he walked off that stage, holding Michelle's hand and looking at Malia and Sasha, the weight of the reality hit him. Behind the cheering crowds lay two wars, a failing economy, and a rising tide of opposition that would spend the next 8 years trying to undo everything he had just promised to build. The victory was the end of the story for the voters, but for Barack Obama, the real struggle, the historic, grinding work of the presidency, was just one sunrise away. By 2011, the hope and change posters had faded, replaced by the graying hair on the president's temples and the grueling daily grind of a divided Congress. But deep within the intelligence community, a thread was being pulled, a thread that had been dangling since the smoke cleared over Lower Manhattan in 2001. For months, a small group of analysts had been tracking a courier. This path led to a high-walled compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. It wasn't a cave in the mountains, it was a fortress in a suburban neighborhood. There was no internet, no trash collection, and a mysterious figure who paced the courtyard but never left. They called him the Pacer. President Obama faced a choice that would define his legacy and haunt him if it failed. The intelligence wasn't 100%. Some CIA analysts said the probability that the man was Osama bin Laden was 80%. Others said 40%. His vice president, Joe Biden, and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates were wary, remembering the disastrous Desert One rescue attempt in 1980 that cost Jimmy Carter his presidency. "I can't tell you for certain he's there," Leon Panetta told him. Obama looked at the model of the compound on the table in the Situation Room. If he sent a drone and it was just a local family, he'd be a murderer. If he sent a team of SEALs and they were captured or killed by the Pakistani military, it would be an international catastrophe. If he did nothing, the man who killed 3,000 Americans stayed free. "It's a 50-50 proposition," Obama mused privately. But on the morning of April 29, 2011, in the diplomatic room, he made the call. Go. The night of May 1st is now etched in history through a single photograph. A room full of the world's most powerful people, huddled, tense, watching a silent digital feed. Obama sat in a quarter chair, not at the head of the table, leaning forward. He watched as one of the Black Hawk helicopters clipped a wall and went down in the compound. The room went silent. The president didn't yell. He gripped the arms of his chair. Minutes felt like hours. Then the radio crackled with the voice of a seal. Geronimo ID'd. Geronimo EKIA. Enemy killed in action. The most wanted man in the world was gone. But as the SEALs began their frantic exit, blowing up their own downed helicopter to protect its technology, the president remained stoic. There were no high fives yet. Not until those birds cleared Pakistani airspace. When he finally walked into the East Room at 11:35 p.m. to address the nation, the audacity of hope had evolved into the gravity of responsibility. He told the world, justice has been done. Outside the White House gates, thousands of young people, the same generation that had voted for him in 2008, gathered spontaneously to sing the national anthem. For a brief, fleeting moment, the jagged lines of American politics vanished. The man with the funny name had delivered the closure a nation had sought for a decade. But as the lights in the White House dimmed that night, Obama knew the victory wouldn't last. In Washington, the brief truce of a national triumph would soon be swallowed by the rising tide of the 2012 election and a new, even more bitter era of obstruction. By 2015, the White House felt like a fortress under siege. The optimism of 2008 had been replaced by a weary pragmatism. The president had seen the failure of gun control legislation after the horror of Sandy Hook, a defeat he called his darkest day. He had watched the rise of racial tensions from Ferguson to Baltimore. He was a man who believed in the power of words, yet he felt as though his words were hitting a brick wall. Then came June 17, 2015. In Charleston, South Carolina, a young white supremacist walked into the historic Mother Emanuel AME Church. He sat with the congregants for an hour of Bible study before opening fire, killing 9 people, including the Reverend Clementa Pinckney. It was a crime designed to start a race war. Obama received the news in the Oval Office. He was tired of giving eulogies. He had given too many. He told his speechwriter, Cody Keenan, that he wasn't sure he had anything left to say that hadn't been said a dozen times before. The funeral for Reverend Pinckney was held on a sweltering Friday. The arena was packed with thousands of mourners, the air thick with grief and the hum of electric fans. When Obama took the lectern, he began a traditional eulogy. He spoke of the blinding ignorance of the killer and the terrible power of the Confederate flag. But then something shifted. The president paused. A long, heavy silence stretched for over 10 seconds, an eternity in a televised speech. He looked down at his notes, then looked up at the congregation. The professor was gone. The politician was gone. He began to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. His voice was unaccompanied, raw, and slightly off-key, but it possessed a power that no policy paper could ever contain. One by one, the ministers behind him stood up, then the choir, then the thousands in the rafters. The song became a roar of defiance against hatred. In that moment, Obama wasn't just a president. He was a bridge. He was using the oldest tools of the American experience, faith and music, to hold a fractured nation together. The Charleston moment became a turning point for his final years. It gave him the momentum to push through a series of historic wins: the legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide, the groundbreaking Paris Climate Agreement, and the controversial but historic Iran nuclear deal. Yet as he entered the lame duck phase of his presidency, the shadow of the future began to loom. The 2016 election was beginning, and the man who would eventually replace him was building a movement based on the total rejection of everything Obama stood for. Obama often quoted Dr. King, saying, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." But in his final months in the West Wing, he had to grapple with a difficult truth. The arc doesn't bend on its own. It requires hands to pull it, and sometimes those hands get tired. The final weeks of 2016 were a blur of bittersweet nostalgia and frantic activity. Inside the West Wing, the Obamaites, the young staffers who had started as idealistic kids in 2008 and were now seasoned, weary professionals, were packing boxes. The walls, once covered in photos of the first family and the iconic Situation Room shot, were being stripped bare. In the Oval Office, the president sat at the resolute desk one last time. He spent hours writing letters to the families of fallen soldiers, to citizens who had written to him about their struggles, and most importantly, a letter to his successor, a tradition of grace that he insisted on upholding despite the deep ideological chasm between them. On the morning of January 20th, 2017, the atmosphere was surreal. After greeting the incoming president on the North Portico, Obama walked through the halls he knew by heart. He looked at the Rose Garden, where he had announced the capture of bin Laden and the passage of the ACA. He looked at the swing set on the South Lawn where Malia and Sasha had played when they were children. As the inauguration ceremony concluded, the Obamas were escorted to Executive One, the helicopter that serves as Marine One when the president is aboard. This was the final flight. As the helicopter lifted off from the Capitol grounds, it circled the National Mall. From the window, Barack Obama looked down at the monuments: the Lincoln Memorial, where he had stood as a young senator; the Washington Monument, casting its long shadow; and the thousands of people gathered below. For 8 years, he had been the center of the world's gravity. Now, as the helicopter headed toward Andrews Air Force Base, that weight began to lift. Michelle leaned over and squeezed his hand. "We did it," she whispered. But the story didn't end with a flight into the sunset. The after-presidency of Barack Obama became a new kind of laboratory. He didn't disappear into a quiet retirement of golf and library dedications. Instead, he and Michelle launched a production company, wrote memoirs that broke global records, and established the Obama Foundation. He moved from holding power to mentoring it. He realized that his greatest legacy wasn't a law or a treaty, but the millions of young people who saw his face and suddenly believed that they too could lead. In his final address to the American people, he returned to the theme that had started it all in a small office in Chicago. "I am asking you to believe, not in my ability to bring about change, but in yours." The story of Barack Obama is the story of a man who believed that the American experiment was worth the struggle. He left the White House not as a king, but as a citizen, a title he often said was the most important one in a democracy. As he walked onto the beach in Hawaii for his first real vacation in a decade, the man with the funny name looked out at the Pacific, finally free from the bubble, but forever woven into the tapestry of the country he had changed, and the country that had changed him.